I'd be lying if I told you my hands weren't shaking as I lit those incense sticks. I propped them up in a little glass jar and set it between the candles. And then after a quick glance at Claire and Patrick, I said, "Last chance to back out. You both sure you want to go through with this?" Claire bit her bottom lip, nodding slightly, while Patrick rolled his eyes. We were on the hardwood floor next to my bed. Around us, the darkened house slept. "Wait, you actually think this will work?" Patrick asked. "I wouldn't go to all this trouble if it didn't. And FYI, it definitely won't work if you don't drop the sarcasm. Spirits pick up on bad energies. So ghosts are less likely to appear around skeptics. How convenient." And Claire said, "Give it a rest, Pat. Nobody forced you to join us. If you're not into it." She motioned past their sleeping bags towards the door. Despite her short stature, Claire had more bite in her bark than most people would assume. Patrick wrinkled his nose. He was a tall guy with rosy cheeks and tidy black hair. For a moment, it looked as though he might storm off, but instead, he grabbed his inhaler and took a puff. "I'll cross my fingers something exciting happens. Will that do?" "Well, let's find out," I said. "Oh, and one more thing. If anything does happen, don't scream. If my mom catches us, she'll throw a fit. She thinks that I'll accidentally summon a demon or something." The floral, woody scent of burning incense wafted through the room as I double-checked my notes and adjusted the candles. Patrick made small talk while I finished setting things up. "Who are you trying to contact?" he asked Claire. "My sister, Alex. She had died in a car accident when I was little." And Patrick started to say, "Is that how..." but then stopped. "Is that how I got my limp?" she finished. He shrunk back, deflated. "Sorry." "Oh, it's okay. The accident happened over on Bloomfield Avenue. You know that crossing before the bridge?" "I know it." "There never used to be a traffic light there. Dad slowed down to look ahead, but he didn't see the oncoming truck." She stared at the floor, as though having a terrible vision of her sister. "Alex died, but I got off with 36 stitches plus my John Wayne walk." And quickly, Patrick reached over and clasped her hands inside his. "Let's hope she's listening tonight." And Claire smiled, her brown eyes all shiny with tears. Patrick's eyes locked onto mine. I sighed. "My grandpa. I want to contact my grandpa. He died 4 years ago and The two of them gave me some space. My dad had problems. He was probably schizophrenic. He used to do some weird stuff, like stand in the corner and talk to walls." My heart performed little somersaults in my chest. I sorely wanted to tell them how I would wake up and find Dad standing at the foot of my bed, a big creepy smile plastered across his face. But at that moment, it felt like he haunted me. And did they need to know how he stood rooted on the spot, periodically reaching forward to tickle the soles of my feet? Or how I would wake up and find him squatting alongside my bed, his nose pushed up against mine. "What are you doing, Daddy?" I would cry, and then he would whisper, "Making sure you're safe, honey," while glancing at the walls. And younger me would picture monsters or ghosts or giant rats hidden in the shadow of the room. No, we could skip all that. I wanted to contact Grandpa, not Dad. I said, Mom tried to make him see a doctor, and when she finally kicked him out, he snapped. He used a spare key to come into the house after dark and I hesitated. Images of Dad shaking me awake and cradling my head against his chest, while waving a butcher knife around the room, reeled before my eyes. I swallowed a gulp, and checked that I was safe. Mom freaked out, obviously, and the police got involved and it turned into this whole ordeal. That's when Grandpa stepped in. He was old, but he was built like a bulldozer. Up until the 70s, he was doing push-ups and swimming in lakes. When Mom told him what had happened, he moved in with us. He even brought his gun. "He had a gun?" Patrick asked, shocked. I nodded. He grew up on a farm and was ex-army. There's some sort of exemption that you can get. Anyway, Dad sued for shared custody, and Grandpa said that if any social workers tried to take me away, he'd stick his foot so far up their behinds that they'd be able to taste his toe jam. A half laugh, half sob escaped from my mouth. One night, Dad broke in and carried me into his car. While Mom called the police, Grandpa grabbed his gun and drove after us. Dad kept saying that I paused to think carefully, that he would come to rescue me. Somehow, Grandpa made him swerve off the road, and then Dad reached into the glove compartment, grabbed a knife and circled toward the hood. I remember Grandpa started shooting right as Dad had lunged, and then they fell past the point where I could see. A little later, 2 officers arrived. They told me to close my eyes and they took me home. They think that Dad had planned to drive us off a bridge. Something about killing me to protect me. If Grandpa hadn't stepped in, I'd be dead. And I never even got a chance to say. As my voice trailed off, Patrick and Claire crawled forward to give me a hug. It felt nice. And Patrick said, "I've got my fingers and toes crossed for you both." I cleared my throat and smiled. "Okay, give me your hands and close your eyes." They did. "We welcome any spirits listening to join our circle. Please make your presence known." Silence. "If any of our loved ones are out there, we're here. We love you and we're listening." Even though the house kept still, Claire squeezed my fingers a little tighter. "It's okay," I said to her. "Try to relax. It'll keep the channels clear." Addressing the room as a whole, I said, "If you're out there, give us a sign." A window rattled in its housing. Claire's hand rattled too. I said, "Don't panic, this is what we hoped for." Then in a more soothing tone I added, "We are here. Whenever you are ready, reach out." A cold draught made all 3 of us shudder. There was a faint clatter like gentle knocking or mice across the floor. Claire pulled away and stifled a yelp. "What's wrong?" I asked, the ritual now abandoned. "There was something there." She pointed past Patrick's shoulder. I looked at Patrick, who was sitting comfortably, bored even. "You feel anything?" He shrugged. "Was it Alex?" he asked Claire. "No," she replied sharply, her eyes darting around the room. "Definitely not." "What did it look like?" I asked. "I don't know, a shadow. And it was right above your head, Pat." "Do you want to keep going?" I asked. She contemplated for a moment. "Let's give it another try, but if I see that thing again, I want to stop." "Okay, give me your hands." I straightened my spine. "We welcome any good spirits to join our circle." Claire's right hand got all moist and slippery. Mine did too. I repeated the mantra several times. As I did, those endless, grinning jack-o'-lantern nightmares felt very, very close. Ever since Grandpa had died, I had suffered recurring dreams about giant faces embedded in the walls, their skin made of brick or cracked plaster. They would smile and yell and laugh. I felt constantly spied on. My therapist said those dreams were a manifestation of the trauma plus the guilt about Grandpa's death. He had died protecting me after all. Out of nowhere, it felt like we were being watched, that we weren't alone. I imagined shapes crouched around the room, barely visible against the candlelight. Patrick reeled his hand away, now breathing heavily, and made a series of quick, rhythmic grunts. Each exhale shook his entire body. "Patrick," I asked, concerned. "It's the incense." He coughed into his closed fist several times before shaking his inhaler. Keep going." My heart settled. After we linked back up, I repeated the mantra. For the next few minutes, there was absolute silence, interrupted only by Patrick's occasional sputters. Out of nowhere, a chill slid up my spine, across my shoulders and spreading out. I wondered whether the others felt this dizzying sense of presence. The presence swam over Claire and settled between us. It couldn't be anything corporeal. My heart kicked into a higher gear. Had Grandpa come to say goodbye? Invisible fingertips caressed my hair. My legs began to wobble. I peeked out of my right eye. The candles flickered, threatening to go out. My friend's misty breathing pulled together with the incense fumes, and for a moment, it almost looked as though there was something there. A face in the condensation. Summoning all of my courage, I whispered, "Grandpa?" Claire trembled. Patrick shuddered. Somebody walked over his grave, Grandpa would say. He felt so close. "If you're there, please." Before I could finish, Patrick fell onto the floor like a rag doll, and my pulse skyrocketed. While Patrick rolled around fighting for air, Claire and I dove forward, knocking over the incense and the candles, and each grabbed an arm. His throat sounded like a rusty chainsaw struggling to start. Globs of saliva ran along his chin. Maybe Mom was right. Maybe we had invited some kind of demon into our circle. He went into furious convulsions, and then grabbed my wrist and groaned, "Inhaler," between ratcheted coughs. That settled me down a little. Patrick could barely manage a breath, but at least it was a human problem. I grabbed the inhaler, gave it a shake and held it up to his mouth, and I pushed the trigger. His coughing fit gradually tapered off into minor growls and sniffs. "Are you okay?" I asked, once he was well enough to sit up. He nodded. I strained to listen. The house stayed completely still. My mom hadn't heard the racket. Slouching back, I said, "Okay, I guess we're done." And Claire let out a sigh of relief, one hand against her chest. For the next few minutes, I rubbed Patrick's back until his breathing sounded normal again. And then my friends climbed in their sleeping bags while I cleared up the candles, hopped into bed and pulled up my blanket. "Night, everyone," I said. Claire said goodnight while Patrick stayed oddly quiet. None of us made contact, which had sucked, but at least we stayed safe. For a moment, I actually thought that weird presence had attacked Patrick. My heart was still beating a little too fast. But now it was gone. We could forget the whole thing ever happened. Sometime after midnight, that odd sense of presence had returned, hanging over my room like a storm cloud. I studied the room and everything in it. How come my friends hadn't stirred? There's no way anybody could sleep through this. It was like being trapped in a jungle, surrounded by trees and undergrowth, watched by unseen eyes. As I pulled the blanket over my head, that awful sensation seemed to swell. I steered my thoughts elsewhere, to how Grandpa would race me from the play park to his car, always giving me enough of a head start to win. Those fond memories dissolved when something shuffled across the wooden floor. Slowly, very slowly, I pulled the blanket down toward my chin. My nightshirt became a drenched rag against my back. I expected to see the faces in the walls staring down at me, grinning, laughing. But the walls were empty, normal. For a moment, my pulse settled. But then once my eyes had adjusted to the gloom, I had to bite down on a scream. Because there was an out-of-place object peeking up over the foot of my bed. The top half of somebody's head. A pale face against the darkness. It was Patrick, except he seemed different. His skin had grooves that weren't there before, and the corners of his mouth were curled into an awful pumpkin grin. Still squatting low, he shuffled along around the edge of the bed and stopped directly beside me. Now there wasn't a single doubt in my mind that Patrick had been replaced, forced out, used as a mask by whatever entity invaded our seance. After swallowing a gulp, I worked up the courage to say, "What are you doing, Pat?" And then the figure reached forward, pushing those distorted lips right up against my ear, and whispered, "Making sure you're safe, honey."